Parents, imagine that you're watching a high-stakes construction project. Day after day, you look out the window and you watch this structure being built brick by brick, beam by beam, and this is really what it's like to watch your teenage son grow up. He's building his identity to form a healthy, resilient sense of self. A young man needs what we call an integrated life. And it's a state of being where his internal values, his secret thoughts, and his external behavior all seamlessly match, and where there's no contradiction. Who is that he is who he says he is, whether he's in the locker room at school or at the dinner table or alone in his bedroom. But what happens when a pornography addiction enters the picture? That construction project, it's not just paused. Unfortunately, it is violently disrupted. Instead of building a unified, strong identity, the addiction forces him to construct a hidden, secret addition to his life. It creates what we call in psychotherapy a fractured self. So parents, if you have recently discovered that your son is viewing pornography, or if you deeply suspect that he's hiding some type of a digital secret, well, I get it. Your heart is probably breaking, and I do want you to hear me clearly on this. You might even feel betrayed or angry, or maybe just entirely unequipped or to help him, or paralyzed by your own guilt. You're asking yourself, well, where did I go wrong? Who is this boy sitting in my house? Or I want you to take a deep breath right now. Drop your shoulders. You're not alone, and your son, it's not broken beyond repair. Welcome to the Parent Guide, helping your teen to overcome pornography addiction. This podcast, I'm your host, Matt Bulkley. I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and every day in my practice, I walk alongside families navigating this exact digital wilderness in 2026. It's pornography addiction among teens, and today I'm going to pull back the curtain on the complex psychology of what I call the double life. We're going to look directly at what peer-reviewed research says about how today's modern pornography alters the developing teenage brain. And probably most importantly, we're not just going to diagnose the problem, but we're going to outline the exact levels of clinical intervention that you can use, ranging from specialized at-home recovery, the Recovery Toolbox, to intensive wilderness therapy to bring your teenage son back to wholeness. So pull up a chair, take a deep breath. We are going to dive deep today. We're going to fight for your son's heart together. Well, parents, to fix a structural failure, we first have to understand its architecture. What does a repetitive pornography habit actually do to a young man's psyche? And in developmental psychology, our foundational blueprint frequently goes back to Erik Erikson, the stages of psychosocial development. And Erikson noted that the core non-negotiable task of the teen years from ages 12 to 18 is what we refer to as identity versus role confusion. So a teenager's primary biological and psychological job is to answer one question: who am I? They try on different personalities or hobbies or social groups. It's like outfits to see what fits. But when pornography enters his daily routine, it introduces a toxic variable. It forces him to begin living a double life, which traps him in this state of perpetual agonizing role confusion. He splits himself into two distinct, irreconcilable personas. So let's break down these two personas, because understanding them is the key to understanding your son's behavior. So maybe we call this the persona versus the shadow. So persona, this is the version of your son that he presents to you or to his teachers or his coaches or his peers. He smiles, does his homework, maybe runs on the cross-country team or plays soccer, maybe plays video games with friends on Discord, and he looks like a compliant, standard, good. He wears this mask because he desperately craves the validation and fears rejection. The shadow behind closed doors in the dead of night, under the glow of a smartphone screen, he slips into the shadow. And this is his secret shame-fueled identity in the digital world. And it is populated by images and videos and behaviors that completely contradict the values of his persona. And here is the deep tragedy of the psychological fracture here, this split, it prevents him from knowing who he truly is. He stops developing organically. Instead of learning how to navigate real world emotions or awkward social interactions and healthy emergent sexuality, he becomes an actor playing a part. So he loses touch with his genuine self before he really even has a chance to fully form it. So to understand what this looks like outside of like theory textbook, let me share a case scenario from my clinical practice, and we'll call him Jared. Jared was 16 when his mother found explicit search history on an old tablet, and Jared was an Eagle Scout. He was an honor student. He was the kid who helped neighbors with yard work, and his parents were completely blindsided by this discovery. And so when Jared started treatment and sat in my office, he couldn't even look me in the eye. He told me, I feel like a fraud every single day when people praise me for being a good kid. It actually hurts because I feel like if they actually knew what I was doing last night or what I was looking at, they would see me with disgust. And Jared's persona was functioning beautifully, but his shadow was consuming his internal world. The tension between the two was causing severe emotional exhaustion. He was spending half of his psychological energy maintaining a lie, which was leaving him empty for real life. Now, as a parent, you might ask a very common question. I hear this from well-meaning parents all the time. Something to the effect of, "Well, Matt, isn't this just a phase? Did generations before him look at magazines in the woods? Isn't this just typical normal teenage curiosity?" Well, and I want to answer that gently, but directly. So no, it's actually not the same. Today's digital landscape is fundamentally neurobiologically different from anything previous generations experienced. Certainly, our generation. We're not dealing with a static paper magazine. We're not dealing with the typical Playboy from the 1980s. We're dealing with an infinite hyper-stimulating delivery system. So, and to make that point, let's look at the science. So, landmark study published in JAMA Psychiatry examined the brains of frequent pornography users using functional neuroimaging, and what the neuroscientists found was pretty staggering. Frequent pornography viewing is associated with a physical reduction in gray matter volume in the prefrontal cortex, specifically in the part of this striatum. It's an area that's heavily linked to the brain's reward system and executive decision making. So high speed stream pornography internet, as we know, floods the prefrontal cortex with dopamine, and with continuous use, this causes gray matter reduction. And when a teen boy uses this delivery system, his brain, we talked about, flooded with this really unprecedented evolutionary novel level of dopamine. And as you know, dopamine is that neurochemical responsible for drive, motivation, anticipation, pleasure. And in nature, a high dopamine spike requires work, something like building a relationship or winning a game or learning a skill. And pornography provides this massive but effortless dopamine jackpot with just simply the swipe of a thumb. And because the adolescent brain is in this critical window of intense neuroplasticity, meaning that it is literally rewiring itself based on repeated experiences, it begins to rapidly restructure around this artificial hyper-stimulating reward loop. So the brain prunes away pathways for normal pleasure and builds a superhighway to the digital screen. Well, let's look at another realistic scenario to see how this plays out in real life. So we'll give you another case scenario. We'll call him Ethan. Of course, names changed for confidentiality's sake, but Ethan, 15-year-old, sophomore in high school, straight A student, a talented athlete. His parents think he's thriving because his grades are good. But Ethan has been watching high-speed pornography every night for the last 18 months. And at first, started with just curiosity, but it has evolved into a deeply grooved compulsion. And when Ethan feels stressed about maybe a chemistry exam or feels rejected by a girl at school, his brain doesn't seek out a healthy coping mechanism. It doesn't just want to go for a walk or talk to his dad. Well, why? Because those activities release a normal, slow trickle of dopamine. Ethan's neural pathway have been paved to seek the immediate massive dopamine spike of the screen, seek out pornography to numb that discomfort. But notice what happens immediately after the screen goes black. Well, the dopamine plummets below baseline, and then toxic shame sets in. Ethan looks at his reflection in the dark phone screen and thinks, geez, if my parents knew who I really was, they wouldn't even love me. To survive that intense emotional pain, Ethan, he doesn't confess. Instead, he just thickens the wall between his persona and his shadow, and that fracture deepens in his brain, continues to wire the habit into his changing physiology. And living this double life, well, it takes a massive round the clock psychological toll. The longer the fracture exists without intervention, the deeper the roots grow. Let's break down the warning signs. So if you could see really right now in the short term, and what happens if the pattern is allowed to harden over a space of months or years and into adulthood. So in the teen years, it'll look like hypervigilance and anxiety, the constant fight or flight state due to the fear of getting caught, which creates elevated cortisol levels. And then looking long term, that leads to the condition that we call anhedonia, which is that inability to feel pleasure from normal everyday activities due to burnt out dopamine receptors. So the short term, hypervigilance and anxiety. The long term, it's going to turn into anhedonia. So as far as relational health, well, in the teen years, it probably looks something like emotional withdrawal, maybe isolation in the bedroom. But the long term on relational health into young adulthood is going to be an intimacy deficit, where something like viewing romantic relationships through the lens of performance and objectification rather than authentic connection. So in adolescence, it'll probably look something to the effect of defensiveness or irritability, which things like unprovoked anger or high volatility over maybe privacy boundaries, or you taking a position to not lock his door or turn his phone in at night. And then in the young adult years, we're talking about the phenomenon called compartmentalization, which just be this rigid coping mechanism when life is permanently split into like the clean and the dirty boxes, which is so damaging for future marriages and careers. And really the culmination of all of that, the most dangerous long-term consequence is the development of a shame-based identity. So there's a profound clinical difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says, well, I've made a mistake, but my behavior, it didn't match my values, but also recognizing that guilt is healthy because it drives a behavioral change. Whereas in comparison to shame, which says, well, I am a mistake. My core identity is flawed. And when a young man carries a shame-based identity into his 20s, it becomes the perfect fertile breeding ground for secondary things like substance addictions or clinical depression, and this chronic sense of unworthiness that can sabotage things like a career or potential marriage, future parenting style. Well, parents, I know that what we've discussed to this point so far, it sounds daunting, and it can feel heavy to hear the depth of the crisis, but I do want you to anchor yourself in some encouraging clinical news today, and that is that the teen brain is incredibly malleable, and thanks to that very same neuroplasticity that allowed the addiction to form, the fracture can be completely healed as well. The brain can rewire itself back to baseline, but it does require that us as parents, we step out of the denial, step into courage, disrupt the pattern before the concrete dries on his adult identity. And so for teens who are in maybe the early to moderate stages of this struggle, when they want to change, they recognize that they're stuck and the communication lines at home are still somewhat intact. This would be where we would want to utilize the gold standard of at-home intervention. And this would be a structured, entirely shame-free and highly practical approach centered around 3 core tools designed specifically for the adolescent brain, which we call the Recovery Toolbox for teens. So this includes the Breaking Free Workbook, which is a clinical approach, covers 10 core concepts that help to unpack personal triggers and work through the shame. Second would be the Parent Guide, which is the workbook designed for the parents that gives us as parents non-confrontational scripts and helps us to walk right alongside our teen. And then third, 101 Tips for Quitting Porn, which is the tactical, real-time, day-to-day urge disruption resource. So, and let's look at how each of these 3 elements work together to build a bridge across the fracture. So with the Recovery Toolbox for Teens, it's an interactive, highly engaging workbook. It doesn't lecture or condemn your son. Instead, it speaks to him like an adult, helping him to understand his unique triggers, unpacking the biology of his habits, and allowing him to actively participate in his own healing journey. And the parent guide for parents, you realize you cannot fix this for him, but you must walk with him. And the guide equips you with the exact clinical language, healthy boundary setting techniques, and the emotional tools that you need to support him without resorting to ineffective tactics, yelling or crying, or useless lectures that only drive him deeper into that shadow. And 101 tips for quitting porn, as I stated, a highly practical, tactical roadmap when your son's alone, 11 p.m. and his brain is screaming for that dopamine spike. He doesn't need a lecture on morality. He needs a tactic. And this guide gives him the daily actionable steps to resist urges in the heat of the moment and to actively rebuild those healthy neural pathways. And these tools, they pull the secret out of the dark and into the light. They give your family shared language, allowing his shadow and his persona to fuse back into one honest and whole and integrated young man. Well, parents, let's be entirely honest. I know that sometimes the digital gravity is simply too strong. Sometimes the addiction is too deeply entrenched. Sometimes it has progressed to that place where it's going to take a significant intervention, and maybe this involves a level of trauma or shame that's just too profound, or the parent-child relationship has become so toxic and fractured that at-home tools or traditional outpatient therapy, going into the office once a week, or the use of internet filters are just simply ineffective. And so if your teen is sneaking devices or escalating into these increasingly risky or illicit digital behaviors, or completely spiraling into depression or school failure, radical systemic disruption is going to be needed. And in these pervasive high-risk circumstances, the ultimate evidence-based clinical intervention is our Star Guides Wilderness Therapy Program. Star Guides takes teen boys completely out of the toxic digital ecosystem and places them in a healing, grounding environment of the wilderness. And why is this environment so uniquely effective for this phenomena of the fractured self? Well, it operates on three distinct clinical levels. So number one is the true digital detox. By removing the device, the cell towers, the screens entirely, Star Guides disrupts that immediate dopamine loop. This allows his fried dopamine receptors to reset naturally back to a baseline to get a recalibration. His nervous system finally steps out of that chronic fight or flight. Second would be the specialized clinical intervention. Star Guides isn't a generic outdoor program. It is designed by myself and Doc Dan. Licensed clinicians deliver specialized, compulsive, sexual specific therapy to disrupt the sexual behaviors and the digital addictions. It doesn't just look like behavioral compliance. We target the core trauma, the deep-seated identity fracture, and the toxic shame underneath the habit. And then finally, a profound parent-child reset away from the daily friction, the arguments, the conflict over screen time, and the defensiveness of everyday life. Star Guides brings parents and sons back together through structured family therapy components. It tears down the walls of the secret life and replaces them with a solid foundation of vulnerability, truth, honesty, transparency, and shared family healing. So if your home has become a war zone, Star Guides offers the professional scaffolding necessary to save your son's future. Well, parents, I know that discovering your son's secret life is heartbreaking. It's a moment of deep grief for any parent, but I want you to reframe that grief today, because it's also an invitation. It is an invitation to build a relationship with your son that is based on who he actually is, rather than the mask that he's been wearing. And by stepping into his life with unconditional love, with rock solid clinical boundaries and the right professional resources, you can help your son break character, step off the stage of the double life, and begin the beautiful process of becoming whole and integrated and into that honest man who he can be. So don't wait for the concrete to dry on his adult identity. Your son is worth the intervention. So if you're ready to take that crucial first step today, look at the resources available right now. You can access the Recovery Toolbox for Teens. It's in the bookstore. It includes in the bookstore at therapyassociates.net. It includes the 3 workbooks: the Breaking Free Workbook, the Parent Guide, 101 Tips for Quitting Porn. And you can start that healing in your home this week. You can do it as a parent-led intervention, or you can use the toolbox with an outpatient clinician in your area. And parents, if you're dealing with more severe high-risk situations where you need a radical disruption, then reach out to our admissions team at Star Guides to learn how this specialized outdoor treatment program can save your son's future. All the links and the clinical information are available in the show notes of this episode and at the websites therapyassociates.net and starguides.net. Parents, thanks for listening to this episode today. Keep showing up, keep setting healthy boundaries, above all, keep fighting for your son's heart. He is still in there and he is worth the fight. I'm Matt Bulkley, and I'll see you next week.